Good morning, children. We have studied that a finance manager basically takes three types of decision: investment decision, financing decision, and the dividend decision. In the previous video, we have studied about the financing decision. Investment decision. In this video, we will study about the financing decision and the dividend decision. So financing decision, these are decisions which tells you about the quantum of finance or composition of funds from various long-term sources. So financing decision, every company requires the money to run the business. Now from where that money will come is basically the decision made by the finance manager, whether to take that money in the form of loan or whether to take the money in the form of equity, that is from the owners. So from where to raise the fund is basically the financing decision taken by the finance manager. He takes both types of money, a long term money and also the short term money. Long term money is taken through the capital budgeting process, and short term money is taken from the working capital process. Now financing decision involves decision whether or not to use the combination of ownership and borrowed fund. So first the manager has to decide that the owner's money and the borrowed money, that is the equity and debt, can be used, or a combination of both can be used. Then he also determine their precise ratio, that how much equity, that is owner's fund, is required and how much debt, that is the borrower's fund, is required. So a financial manager has to make a decision. A company needs a judicious mix of both the debt and equity. Now if the business is financed through the debt, that is the debt involves financial risk, that is risk of default on payment of interest or borrowed fund and the repayment of the principal amount. So if the company has taken more money or raised the money more from the debt financing, that is in the form of loan, and if the company will not repay the loan on time, then the business will be under risk. The banks will close the business if the interest of the borrowed money is not paid on time. So by increasing the debt fund, the business is always under the risk. Whereas shareholders fund involves no fixed commitment. But if the finance manager has taken the money through the equity, that is more of the owner's fund, then there is no risk of the repayment of the money on the fixed period of time or also in the form of interest. So business is not under the risk. So debt financing always increases the risk of the business, while the equity financing, that is shareholders fund financing, there is less risk of the business, but it is very costly to raise the fund through the equity process or through the shareholders funding. Now the next is ownership fund versus debt fund. They can be compared on the basis of factors such as interest, dividend payout and repayment of the principal, tax deductibility and risk and flotation cost. So whether to raise the money through the ownership fund or the debt fund, a manager has to compare the interest rate, interest and dividend payout. The manager can also compare whether to raise the money from the owner's fund or the debt fund by repayment of principal. He can also decide on the tax deductibility risk and flotation cost is also taken into consideration while raising the owners fund or the debt fund. Now, what are the factors required or factors that affect in the financing decision? Now, the first factors that affect the financing decision is cost. The cost of raising fund from different sources are different. So I have already told you that to raise the money for the business, money can be raised either through the equity or through the debt, that is either from the owners fund or from the loan. Now, cost of both is different. The cheapest source should be selected. The debt fund is always cheaper than the equity fund. So whichever is cheaper, that is decided by the finance manager, and then the money is undertaken to run the business. Now, second decision that affects the financing decision of a finance manager is risk. The risk associated with different sources is different. So the risk associated with owners fund is different and the borrowers fund is also different. More risk is associated with borrowers fund, that is the debt fund. Why? Because debt fund is taken from the bank, loan is taken from the bank, and if the interest of the loan is not paid on time, then the bank will close the business. While if the money is raised from the owners fund, that is equity fund, then the risk is less. The third factors that affect the financing decision is flotation cost. The cost involved in issuing securities such as broker's commission, underwriter's fees, expenses on prospectus, etc. are called flotation cost. So flotation cost is basically whenever a company wants to raise the money from the share market by issuing shares or the security, then they have to pay the broker's commission because brokers buy and sell the securities or shares. Then underwriter fees is basically if any financial institution has taken the responsibility of giving whole money for the shares, then that financial institution takes a fees, that is called the underwriter's fees. Then while issuing the prospectus of the company also expenses are required. All these small expenses altogether is called the flotation cost. Higher the flotation cost, less attractive is the source of finance. If the debt fund flotation cost is high, then the finance manager will remove it, and if the flotation cost of the equity funding is high, then he will not raise the fund through the equity. So a finance manager has to decide the flotation cost. Wherever there is less flotation cost, that type of financing he will do in his business. The fourth is cash flow position of the business. In case the cash flow position of the company is good enough, then it can easily use borrower's fund and pay interest on time. If the company is very good, if the company is earning a high rate of profit, then the best way for the finance manager is to raise the fund by the borrower's fund or the debt financing, because the company can easily pay the interest, and this is the cheapest way. Debt financing is the cheapest way of raising the fund. Now, fifth factor which the finance manager has to take is the control consideration. In case the existing shareholders want to retain the complete control of the business, then the finance can be raised through the borrowed fund. But when they are ready for dilution of the control over the business, equity can be used for raising finance. Now, if a company is running and the shareholders want the full control, the existing shareholders want a complete control of the business, then the best way of raising the fund is through the debt financing or the borrowed fund. But if the shareholders are ready for the dilution of control over the business, then the finance manager should decide the raising of the fund through the equity process. Now the sixth factor is state of capital market. During boom, finance can easily be raised by issuing shares, but during depression period, raising finance by means of debt is easy. So when the share market is boom, when the share market is growing at a very fast rate, when the Sensex is increasing, at that time the finance manager can raise the fund from the share market, that is equity financing. But when the share market is down, at that time the finance manager should raise the finance through the debt financing. Now the next one is period of finance. So the finance manager can see the time of the financing, time period of the financing. That also affects the, so time period or period of finance also affect the financing decision of the finance manager. For permanent capital requirement, equity share must be issued. So if a finance manager want a permanent capital, then equity financing is the best way. But if he wants that long-term financing should not be done, then the debt financing is the best way. So equity share must be issued as they are not to be paid back, and for long and medium term requirement, preference shares or debentures can be issued. So for the long and medium term, preference shares and debentures can be issued. But if the company wants a permanent capital, permanent finance, then equity share is the best way. Today only this much. Thank you.